What would you do if the person you've been running from your whole life suddenly appeared in front of you? That's exactly what happened to Judge Harrison when a man in simple clothes walked into his courtroom. No lawyer, no case file, no explanation. Just a man who looked him in the eyes and said, "William, we need to talk about Michael." The mahogany gavel struck the bench with the same cold authority it had wielded for 25 years. Judge William Harrison, known throughout Chicago's legal circles as the Hammer, surveyed his courtroom with the calculating gaze of a predator examining its territory. At 58 years old he commanded respect through fear, and had built his reputation on one unshakable principle: mercy was a luxury the guilty didn't deserve. The morning of March 15th began like any other Tuesday in Harrison's domain. The Cook County Superior Courthouse buzzed with the familiar sounds of justice being served. Lawyers shuffling papers, defendants whispering desperate prayers, and families clinging to hope that would soon be crushed under the weight of his verdicts. Harrison's courtroom, Department 47, was where dreams went to die, and where second chances were as rare as snow in July. His clerk Patricia Goldstein had worked under 3 different judges before Harrison, but none had ever made her stomach churn the way he did. At 34, she had witnessed enough broken families and excessive sentences to last several lifetimes. She watched as Harrison adjusted his black robes, the armor he wore to shield himself from any hint of human compassion. "Your Honor," Patricia announced, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil, "we have the Morrison case first on the docket this morning." Harrison's steel-gray eyes flickered toward the defendant's table where James Morrison, a 23-year-old construction worker, sat beside his overworked public defender. Morrison's crime: stealing baby formula from a convenience store because his minimum wage job couldn't cover his infant daughter's needs after his wife had been hospitalized with complications from childbirth. The prosecution painted Morrison as a repeat offender, technically true, since he had shoplifted bread 2 years earlier when he was homeless. The public defender, fresh out of law school and carrying 47 other cases, barely had time to review the file, let alone mount an adequate defense. Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade through silk. "You stand before this court charged with retail theft in the 2nd degree. How do you plead?" Morrison's hands trembled as he stood. His wife sat in the gallery, holding their 3-month-old daughter, her face streaked with tears she'd been fighting back since the hearing began. "I plead guilty, but if I could just explain." "Guilty plea accepted," Harrison interrupted, slamming his gavel before the young father could finish his sentence. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a death knell. "Mr. Morrison, this court sentences you to 18 months in state prison, followed by 2 years probation." "Bailiff, remove the defendant." The collective gasp from the gallery was audible. 18 months for stealing baby formula, a crime that typically carried a maximum of 6 months for a first-time offender. Morrison's wife collapsed into sobs as court officers moved to handcuff her husband. Their infant daughter, startled by the commotion, began crying, her tiny wails serving as a haunting soundtrack to Harrison's brand of justice. "Your Honor," the public defender stammered, "surely the court would consider the extenuating circumstances. My client was trying to feed his child." "The court has made its decision," Harrison replied coldly. "Perhaps Mr. Morrison should have considered the consequences before choosing a life of crime." Next case. Patricia watched the scene unfold with familiar horror. She had seen this play out hundreds of times before: Harrison's complete disregard for human circumstances, his inability to see defendants as anything more than case numbers to be processed through his judicial meat grinder. She wondered, not for the first time, how a man could sit in judgment of others while showing such a complete absence of basic human empathy. But what Patricia didn't know, what no one in that courtroom could have guessed, was that Judge William Harrison's cruelty wasn't born from natural heartlessness. It was forged in the fires of a guilt so profound, so consuming, that he had spent 20 years building walls around his conscience to keep the pain from destroying him entirely. The second case of the morning involved Maria Santos, a 38-year-old single mother who had been caught selling small quantities of marijuana to pay for her son's asthma medication. Her insurance had been canceled when she lost her job at a factory that moved operations to Mexico, and without the medication, her 8-year-old son, Carlos, had been hospitalized twice with severe asthma attacks. Maria's story was heartbreaking in its simplicity. She had never been in trouble with the law before the factory closure 6 months earlier. She had tried working multiple minimum wage jobs, but none provided health insurance, and the cost of Carlos's inhaler, nearly $300, was more than she could afford while paying rent and buying food. Mrs. Santos, Harrison began, his voice devoid of any warmth. You've been charged with possession with intent to distribute a controlled substance. The prosecution has offered a plea bargain for 1 year in county jail and 3 years probation. How do you respond? Maria's court-appointed attorney, an exhausted man in his 50s, who had long ago stopped fighting the system, whispered something in her ear. She nodded reluctantly, tears streaming down her face. Your Honor, Maria said, her English accented with the Spanish of her childhood. I accept the plea, but please, my son needs me. He can't breathe without his medicine, and my mother is too old to take care of him properly. Harrison's expression didn't change. If anything, it seemed to harden further. Mrs. Santos, this court is not concerned with your personal circumstances. You chose to engage in drug trafficking, regardless of your reasons. The court sentences you to the recommended 1 year in county jail, but given the serious nature of drug crimes in our community, I'm adding an additional 6 months to send a message. 18 months total. The gasp from Maria's family in the gallery was audible. Her elderly mother stood up, shouting in Spanish, while her 8-year-old son, Carlos, began crying for his mama. The bailiff moved to escort Maria away as she looked desperately toward her family, knowing she wouldn't see her son for a year and a half. Patricia felt sick to her stomach. Even the prosecutor looked uncomfortable with Harrison's excessive sentence. She had prepared herself for another routine day of watching Harrison destroy lives, but something about this particular morning felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that the universe itself was holding its breath. What Patricia couldn't have known was that 20 miles away, in a small apartment in Harrison's old neighborhood, an 82-year-old woman named Rose Murphy was dying. Rose had been Harrison's kindergarten teacher 43 years earlier, back when he was still Billy Harrison, a sweet, sensitive boy who cried when other children were hurt and dreamed of becoming a teacher like Miss Rose. Rose had followed Billy's career over the years, watching with growing horror as the newspaper reported his increasingly harsh sentences. She had tried to reach out to him several times over the decades, but Harrison had built walls around himself that seemed impenetrable. Now in her final hours, Rose was praying, begging God to send someone to help the boy she once knew, the boy who had been buried alive under 20 years of self-inflicted cruelty. Back in the courtroom, Harrison was preparing for his third case when Patricia noticed something unusual. A man had entered through the back doors and was walking slowly down the center aisle. He didn't look like a typical defendant or attorney. He was dressed simply: jeans, a white button-down shirt, and worn work boots. His dark hair was shoulder-length, and he had a neatly trimmed beard, but it was his eyes that caught Patricia's attention. They were dark, profound, and held a depth of compassion she had never seen before. The man walked with purpose, but without urgency, as if he had all the time in the world. Other people in the courtroom began to notice him too. There was something about his presence that seemed to quiet the usual chatter and shuffle of papers. Even the hardened criminals waiting their turn seemed to calm in his presence. Harrison, absorbed in reviewing his next case file, didn't initially notice the disturbance, but gradually, he became aware of the unusual quiet that had descended over his courtroom. He looked up, following the gaze of everyone present, and saw the man approaching the defendant's table. "Excuse me," Harrison called out, his voice sharp with authority. "Court is in session. Please take a seat, or leave the premises." The man stopped and turned to face Harrison directly. When their eyes met, Harrison felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, a jolt of recognition so profound it made his hands tremble. But that was impossible. He had never seen this man before in his life. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice gentle but carrying an authority that somehow rivaled Harrison's own, "I believe you have a case concerning me." Patricia frantically shuffled through her files. There was no case scheduled involving anyone matching this man's description. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't show any case."
"Check your files more carefully," the man said kindly to Patricia. "Sometimes the most important cases are the ones that seem to appear from nowhere." Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the man's voice, the way he spoke, triggered memories Harrison had spent decades trying to suppress. "Sir, I don't know what game you're playing, but this is a court of law. If you don't have official business here, I'll have you removed for contempt." The man smiled, not mockingly, but with a sadness so deep it seemed to encompass all the pain in the world. "William, I do have business here, very important business, with you." The use of his first name by a complete stranger sent shockwaves through Harrison. No one in his courtroom had dared address him as anything other than "Your Honor" in 25 years. But more than that, the way this man said his name, with familiarity, with love, with a knowledge that seemed to go back decades, filled Harrison with a terror he couldn't explain. "Bailiff," Harrison shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Remove this man from my courtroom immediately." But as the court officers moved toward the stranger, something extraordinary happened. The man didn't resist or run. He simply stood there, and somehow the officers found themselves unable to complete their task. Not because of any physical force, but because something about his presence made violence seem impossible. "William," the man said again, his voice cutting through the chaos with supernatural clarity, "we need to talk about Michael." The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. Michael. The name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years. The name that haunted his dreams and turned his stomach to acid. The name that had transformed him from an idealistic young prosecutor into the heartless machine he had become. Harrison's face went pale, his hands began to shake visibly. The case file he had been holding scattered across his bench as he gripped the edge to steady himself. "How do you know that name?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the stunned silence of the courtroom. "I know many things about you, William," the man replied gently. "I know about the night 20 years ago when you were driving home from a late court session. I know about the rain, and the intersection, and the choice you made that changed everything." Harrison felt the world spinning around him. This was impossible. No one knew the details of that night except him. He had never told another soul, not his wife, not his therapist, not even the priest he had visited once in a moment of weakness before building his walls even higher. "I don't know what you're talking about," Harrison managed to stammer, but his voice lacked any conviction. The man stepped closer to the bench, and Harrison could see his eyes more clearly now. They weren't the eyes of a con man or a blackmailer. They were eyes that held infinite compassion, infinite understanding, and infinite sorrow for the pain that Harrison had been carrying all these years. 20 years ago, on a rainy Thursday night in October, the man continued, his voice gentle but unwavering, "You were driving through the intersection of Ashland and Roosevelt. It was late, you were tired, and you were thinking about the case you had just finished, your first major conviction as a prosecutor." Harrison's breathing became shallow, his heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. How could this stranger know these details? How could anyone know? "The traffic light was yellow, then red, but you were already in the intersection," the man continued, "and that's when you saw him. 7-year-old Michael Rodriguez, running into the street chasing a ball that had bounced away from his friends." The courtroom had fallen into absolute silence. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys. Patricia watched in fascination and growing concern as her boss, the most controlled man she had ever known, began to visibly fall apart. "Stop," Harrison whispered, but the word had no authority behind it. "You had a choice, William," the man said, his voice filled with infinite sadness. "You could have swerved, you could have honked your horn, you could have done anything to warn that little boy. But you were tired, distracted, and for just a moment you hesitated." Tears began to flow down Harrison's cheeks, the first tears he had shed in 20 years. "Please," he begged, his voice broken, "please don't. By the time you reacted it was too late. Michael Rodriguez died that rainy Thursday night, not because you intended to hurt him, but because you froze when action was needed most." The revelation hung in the air like a sword over Harrison's head. Everyone in the courtroom was straining to hear what would come next, but Harrison no longer saw them. All he could see was the face of a 7-year-old boy, with dark eyes and a smile full of missing teeth, a face that had haunted his every waking moment for 20 years. "Who are you?" Harrison asked through his tears. "How do you know this?" The man looked at Harrison with eyes full of love, and said simply, "I'm someone who has been waiting 20 years for you to be ready for this conversation, William. I'm someone who knew Michael Rodriguez, and I'm someone who knows you, not the judge you've become, but the man you used to be before guilt turned your heart to stone." But before Harrison could respond, before he could demand more answers, the man did something that defied all logic. He looked directly at Patricia and said, "Patricia, your mother forgives you for not visiting her before she died. She knows you were afraid of seeing her suffer." Patricia gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. Her mother had died 3 years earlier from cancer, and Patricia had indeed been too afraid to visit her in the hospital during her final days. It was a guilt she carried constantly, but she had never told anyone about it, especially not at work. Then the man turned to the bailiff, a tough ex-cop named Frank Morrison, and said, "Frank, your son didn't die because you failed him. He died because sometimes good people make bad choices, but that doesn't make you a bad father." Frank's face went white. His son had overdosed 2 years earlier, and Frank had blamed himself for not seeing the signs, for not being there enough. He had never discussed his personal life at work, yet somehow this stranger knew his deepest pain. Harrison watched in growing amazement and terror as this mysterious man addressed person after person in his courtroom, revealing secrets and offering comfort for wounds that no one else knew existed. This wasn't a trick or a performance, this was something beyond anything Harrison had ever witnessed. "Who are you?" Harrison asked again, his voice now filled with awe, rather than anger. The man smiled and said, "I'm someone who has been walking with broken people for a very long time, William. I'm someone who specializes in healing hearts that others have given up on. I'm someone who came here specifically for you," and as if to emphasize his words, the man did something that made Harrison's blood run cold. He looked directly at him and said, "I know you've been having the same nightmare for 20 years. Every Tuesday night, you dream about Michael Rodriguez. You see him running into the street, you feel your car make contact, and you wake up screaming his name." Last night was no different. Harrison had indeed had the nightmare again just hours earlier. He woke up at 3:17 a.m., just like he did every Wednesday morning, drenched in sweat and sobbing. His wife, sleeping in the guest bedroom for the past 5 years, hadn't even stirred. She had grown used to his nightmares and his refusal to explain them. "Impossible," Harrison whispered, but even as he said it, he knew he was witnessing something far beyond the realm of possibility. The man stepped closer to the bench, and now Harrison could see details that seemed to shift and change before his eyes. The man's hands, resting gently on the defendant's table, bore what looked like old scars, the kind of scars that might be left by nails or spikes. His feet, visible in worn work boots, seemed to bear similar marks. "William," the man said, his voice now carrying an authority that made Harrison's 25 years of judicial power seem like a child's game. "For 20 years, you've been punishing everyone else for the crime you committed. Every harsh sentence, every denial of mercy, every family you've destroyed, it's all been your way of trying to punish yourself for what happened to Michael." The words hit Harrison like physical blows. He had never consciously made this connection, but as soon as the man said it, Harrison knew it was true. Every excessive sentence had been motivated by his own guilt. Every denial of compassion had been his way of denying forgiveness to himself. "I became a judge to help people," Harrison said weakly, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "No," the man replied gently but firmly. "You became a judge to have power over others, because you felt so powerless the night Michael died. You've spent 20 years trying to create a world where justice is absolute and mercy is absent, because mercy would mean admitting that you yourself are worthy of forgiveness." The truth of these words crashed over Harrison like a tsunami. He saw with crystal clarity how every decision he had made for 20 years had been motivated by his desperate need to punish himself for Michael's death. He had destroyed thousands of lives in his quest to create a universe where guilt was always punished and forgiveness was never granted. "But I don't deserve forgiveness," Harrison sobbed, his judge's composure completely shattered. "Michael Rodriguez is dead because of me. A 7-year-old boy with his whole life ahead of him is dead because I froze for 1 second. The man's expression filled with infinite compassion. "William, do you know what Michael's mother said at his funeral?" Harrison shook his head, afraid to hear the answer. "She said, I don't know who the person was that hit my son, but I know they must be suffering too. I hope someday they can find peace." The words hit Harrison like a lightning bolt. For 20 years he had imagined Michael's family consumed with hatred for him. He had never considered that they might offer forgiveness to the person who had stolen their child from them. "Mrs. Rodriguez spent the last 20 years starting a foundation to improve street lighting and pedestrian safety," the man continued. "She turned her grief into action that has saved dozens of other children from Michael's fate. She has been healing the world while you have been destroying it." Harrison felt something breaking open in his chest, 20 years of suppressed grief and guilt finally finding a crack in the armor he had built around his heart. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've become." The man smiled, and for the first time since he had entered the courtroom, Harrison saw hope in those profound eyes. "That's why I'm here, William, not to condemn you, but to show you a different way." And then, as the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence, the man did something that would be talked about for years to come. He began to glow with a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from within him. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but gentle and welcoming, like the first rays of dawn after the longest night. Who are you? Harrison asked one final time, though somewhere in the deepest part of his soul, he already knew the answer. The man looked at Harrison with eyes full of infinite love, and said simply, I'm the one who has been waiting for you to come home.
The light that emanated from the mysterious man grew brighter, but instead of hurting their eyes, it seemed to bring comfort to everyone in the courtroom. Harrison felt warmth spreading through his chest for the first time in 20 years, not the burning acid of guilt he had grown accustomed to, but something that felt like peace. I don't understand, Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible. What are you saying? The man stepped around the defendant's table and approached the bench. With each step, Harrison felt layers of his carefully constructed armor beginning to fall away. The other people in the courtroom, Patricia, the bailiffs, the attorneys, the defendants waiting their turn, all sat in absolute silence, as if they were witnessing something sacred. 20 years ago, William, when you were driving home from court, you weren't just thinking about your latest case, the man said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. You were thinking about a conversation you'd had with your father that morning, the last conversation you would ever have with him. Harrison's eyes widened. His father had died of a heart attack 2 days after Michael's death, and Harrison had always believed the timing was just a cruel coincidence. No one knew about that final conversation except him. Your father called you at 7 a.m. that Tuesday morning, the man continued. He was proud of your conviction in the Martinez drug case, but he was worried about you. He said you were becoming too hard, too focused on punishment instead of justice. He reminded you why you became a prosecutor in the first place. The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. His father, retired Judge Robert Harrison, had indeed called that morning. Billy, he had said, using the childhood nickname that always made Harrison smile, remember that justice without mercy isn't justice at all, it's just revenge wearing a robe. Dad told me I was losing my way, Harrison admitted, tears streaming freely now. He said I was starting to care more about winning cases than about serving justice. We argued about it. I hung up on him angry, and you never got to apologize, the man said gently. He died believing you were angry with him, and you've carried that guilt alongside the guilt about Michael ever since. Harrison nodded, unable to speak. The weight of 20 years of suppressed emotion was crushing down on him like an avalanche. I killed a child, disappointed my father, and destroyed my own soul all in the span of a week, he finally managed. How do you come back from that? The man reached the bench now, and Harrison could see his face clearly. There was something timeless about his features, as if he had walked the earth for centuries, witnessing humanity's greatest triumphs and deepest failures. His eyes held no judgment, only an infinite capacity for love. You don't come back alone, the man replied. That's why I'm here. Patricia, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, suddenly found herself standing. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to speak. Your Honor, she said softly, I've worked for you for 8 years. I've watched you sentence thousands of people, and I've never seen you show mercy to anyone, not once. Harrison looked at his clerk, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in all their years working together. He saw the pain in her eyes, the weight she carried from watching him destroy so many lives. I know, Harrison said quietly. I'm sorry, Patricia, I'm sorry you've had to be part of what I've done. But the mysterious man shook his head. William, Patricia isn't here by accident. She's been praying for you every day for 5 years. She's been asking God to soften your heart, to help you find your way back to the man you used to be. Patricia gasped. She had indeed been praying for Harrison, but she had never told anyone. During her lunch breaks, she would go to the small chapel in the courthouse basement and light a candle, asking God to help her boss find compassion. Every person in this courtroom is here for a reason today, the man continued, his voice growing stronger. Frank, the bailiff whose son died of an overdose, he's here because he understands the weight of guilt you've been carrying. Maria Santos, who you just sentenced to 18 months for trying to save her son's life, she's here because she represents every parent whose family you've destroyed in the name of your own pain. Harrison turned to look at Maria, who was still sitting in the defendant's chair, her hands cuffed behind her back. Her 8-year-old son, Carlos, was crying softly in the gallery, his small frame shaking with each sob. For the first time, Harrison truly saw them, not as criminals to be processed, but as human beings whose lives hung in the balance. And James Morrison, the man said, nodding toward the young father who had been sentenced just an hour earlier, he's here because his daughter is the same age Michael Rodriguez was when he died. Every time you look at that baby, you see Michael, and it fills you with rage, not at James, but at yourself. The connection hit Harrison like lightning.
He had been unconsciously punishing every young father who appeared before his bench, seeing in them a reflection of the parent he might have been, if he hadn't destroyed that possibility with one moment of inattention. "But here's what you've never understood, William," the man said, his voice becoming even gentler. "Michael Rodriguez didn't die because you're a bad person, he died because you're a human being, and human beings make mistakes. The tragedy isn't that you made an error in judgment, the tragedy is what you've done to yourself and others in response to that error." Harrison felt something shifting deep in his chest, as if a door that had been locked for 20 years was finally beginning to crack open. "But the guilt," he whispered, "it never stops. Every morning I wake up and remember what I did, and it feels like it just happened." "That's because you've never allowed yourself to grieve properly," the man replied. "You've been so focused on punishing yourself that you've never actually mourned the loss of Michael Rodriguez. You've never honored his memory in any way except through self-destruction." The man paused and looked around the courtroom at all the faces watching this unprecedented scene unfold. "Tell me, William, in 20 years of harsh sentences and denied mercy, have you ever prevented another child's death? Has your cruelty made the world safer for anyone?" The question hit Harrison like a physical blow because he knew the answer. His harsh sentences hadn't deterred crime or protected children. If anything, his excessive punishments had destroyed families and created more victims. Young fathers like James Morrison were sent to prison for extended periods, leaving their children without providers. Mothers like Maria Santos were separated from sick children who desperately needed them. "I've made everything worse," Harrison said, the realization crushing him. "I thought I was serving justice, but I've just been spreading the same kind of pain I felt when Michael died." "Yes," the man agreed, but his voice held no condemnation. "But it's not too late to choose a different path." Frank Morrison, the bailiff, suddenly spoke up from his position near the defendant's table. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but what you said about my son, how could you know that?" The man turned to Frank, with the same compassionate gaze he had given Harrison. "I know because I was with him the night he died, Frank. He wasn't alone in that alley. He spoke your name with his last breath, not in anger, but with love. He wanted you to know that his choices weren't your fault." Frank began to weep openly, 24 months of suppressed grief finally finding release. His colleagues looked on in amazement. They had never seen the tough ex-cop show any emotion. "And Patricia," the man continued, "your mother spent her final days talking about you. She was proud of the woman you became, and she understood why you couldn't visit her in the hospital. She knew you loved her too much to watch her suffer." Patricia collapsed into her chair, sobbing with relief. The guilt she had carried for 3 years, the sleepless nights wondering if her mother died thinking she didn't care, began to lift from her shoulders like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. Harrison watched in amazement, as this mysterious stranger brought healing to person after person in his courtroom, but a nagging question remained. "Who are you?" he asked again. "How do you know these things about all of us?" The man smiled, and for a moment, his appearance seemed to shimmer and change. Harrison could have sworn he saw scars on the man's wrists becoming more visible, and there was something about his face that seemed both ancient and eternally young. "I'm someone who has been watching each of you struggle with your pain," the man replied. "I'm someone who knows that broken hearts can be healed, that guilt can be transformed into purpose, and that mercy is not the enemy of justice, it's justice's truest expression." The man walked over to where Maria Santos sat, still handcuffed and confused by everything she was witnessing. "Maria, tell Judge Harrison about your son Carlos. Tell him what you see when you look at your boy." Maria looked uncertainly between the judge and the strange man who seemed to know everyone's secrets. I don't understand what's happening here, but..." She looked at Harrison, and for the first time in the hearing, she spoke directly to him as one human being to another, not as a defendant to a judge.
"Your Honor, when I look at my son, I see everything good in this world. I see hope and innocence and possibility. He wants to be a doctor someday, because he wants to help other kids who can't breathe easily like him. Every time he has an asthma attack, I see his dreams slipping away because I can't afford his medicine." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I never wanted to break the law. I worked 2 jobs after the factory closed, but it still wasn't enough. When Carlos ended up in the emergency room, because I had to choose between his inhaler and our rent, I knew I had to do something. I sold marijuana for 3 weeks, just enough to buy his medicine and catch up on our bills. I never sold to children, never carried a weapon, never hurt anyone." Harrison listened to Maria's words, and for the first time in 20 years he heard a defendant's story with his heart instead of just his mind. He saw the desperation of a mother watching her child suffer, the impossible choices forced on parents by a system that provided no support for those who fell through the cracks. "Carlos reminds me of Michael Rodriguez," Harrison admitted quietly. "Same age, same bright eyes full of dreams. But instead of protecting him like I failed to protect Michael, I was about to take his mother away for 18 months. The mysterious man nodded approvingly. "And now you begin to see the pattern, William. Every defendant who has stood before you has been another opportunity to choose mercy over judgment, to break the cycle of pain instead of perpetuating it. But until today, you chose judgment every time." Harrison turned to look at James Morrison, the young father who had stolen baby formula. "James, what would happen to your daughter if you went to prison for 18 months? James, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout this extraordinary proceeding, spoke up with a trembling voice. "She'd probably end up in foster care, Your Honor. My wife is still recovering from complications after the birth. She can't work right now, and we don't have any family nearby who could help. So my sentence wouldn't just punish you," Harrison said, the full weight of his past decisions crashing down on him. "It would destroy an innocent child's life, just like what happened to Michael Rodriguez destroyed me." "Exactly," the man said. "Every harsh sentence you've handed down has created more victims, more broken families, more children growing up without parents. You've been perpetuating the same cycle of loss that began with Michael's death." Harrison looked around his courtroom, his domain of absolute authority, and saw it with new eyes. Instead of a temple of justice, he saw it as a factory of human misery, a place where broken people were further broken by a system that prioritized punishment over healing. "I don't know how to undo 20 years of damage," Harrison said helplessly. "I don't know how to become the man I was supposed to be." The man approached the bench again, and now Harrison could clearly see those scars on his hands and wrists. They weren't fresh wounds, but they weren't fully healed either, as if they existed in some space between injury and recovery, serving as permanent reminders of a great sacrifice. "You start by making a different choice right now, in this moment," the man said. "You have the power to show mercy to Maria and James. You can choose healing over punishment, hope over despair. You can honor Michael Rodriguez's memory by saving other children instead of destroying their families." Harrison looked at Maria Santos, her son Carlos crying softly in the gallery, and he saw Michael Rodriguez's face superimposed over the boy's features. But instead of the crushing guilt he usually felt, he experienced something new, a sense of purpose, of possibility, of redemption. "Mrs. Santos," Harrison said, his voice stronger than it had been all morning, "I'm going to vacate your sentence." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Patricia dropped her pen. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine in amazement. "Instead of 18 months in prison," Harrison continued, "I'm sentencing you to 200 hours of community service at a pediatric clinic, where you can use your experience as a mother to help other children. I'm also ordering the court to connect you with social services, to help you find stable employment with health benefits." Maria began to cry with relief, and her son Carlos stopped sobbing and looked up with hope in his eyes for the first time since the hearing began. Harrison turned to James Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, your sentence is also vacated. Instead of prison time, you'll perform community service at a food bank, helping other families who are struggling to feed their children. The court will also work with social services to ensure your family receives the support you need." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. Where there had been despair and resignation, now there was hope and possibility. But Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he announced, his voice growing stronger with each word, effective immediately, "this court will implement new sentencing guidelines that prioritize rehabilitation over punishment for non-violent offenses involving parents trying to provide for their children's basic needs." The mysterious man smiled, and his approval seemed to fill the courtroom with warmth. "You're beginning to understand, William. Justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration, it's about healing broken systems and broken people." But then the man's expression became more serious. "However, changing your sentencing practices is only the beginning. You still haven't faced the full truth about Michael Rodriguez's death." Harrison felt his stomach clench with fear. "What do you mean? I told you what happened that night." "You told me what you remember happening," the man replied. "But memory is often distorted by guilt and shame. You've been carrying a burden that isn't entirely yours to bear." The man closed his eyes for a moment, as if accessing some cosmic database of truth. When he opened them again, they seemed to hold the pain of the entire world. "Michael Rodriguez wasn't just chasing a ball that night, William. He was running away from something, from someone who was chasing him." Harrison's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "There was another car at that intersection, William. A car that had been following Michael for 3 blocks, driven by a man with very bad intentions. Michael wasn't playing when he ran into the street, he was running for his life."
The revelation hit Harrison like a tsunami. For 20 years, he had believed that Michael was simply a child at play, that his death was a random tragedy caused by Harrison's moment of inattention. But if what this man was saying was true, you didn't kill an innocent child at play, William. The man continued gently. You accidentally struck a child who was already in mortal danger. If you hadn't been there, if your car hadn't been at that intersection at that exact moment, Michael Rodriguez would have suffered a fate far worse than a quick death. Harrison felt the ground beneath his feet shifting. Everything he had believed about that night, everything he had built his guilt upon, was crumbling. The man who was chasing Michael was named David Kowalski, the man continued. He was a registered sex offender who had been stalking children in that neighborhood for months. The police found him 3 days after Michael's death, and he confessed to following the boy with the intention of abducting him. Harrison's hands were shaking so violently, he could barely hold onto the bench. But I killed him. Michael died, because of me. Michael died, because evil exists in the world, William. Your car ended his life, yes, but it also ended his terror. It prevented something unspeakably worse from happening to him. The man paused, letting this revelation sink in. David Kowalski is serving life in prison for the abduction and murder of 3 other children. Crimes he committed in different cities after Michael's death made him leave Chicago. If you want to carry guilt for the children you couldn't save from him, not for the child whose suffering you ended. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Harrison processed this information. 20 years of self-hatred and self-punishment, based on an incomplete understanding of what had actually happened that night. How do you know this? Harrison asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Because I was there too, William, the man replied, and now his appearance began to change more noticeably. His simple clothes seemed to glow with an inner light, and his face took on an otherworldly beauty. I was with Michael in his final moments. I held him as he passed from this world to the next. He wasn't afraid, William. He was at peace. Harrison stared at the man, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The knowledge of everyone's secrets, the ability to bring healing and comfort, the scars on his hands and feet, the otherworldly presence that seemed to transform everyone who encountered him. Your Harrison began, but couldn't finish the sentence. I am who I am, the man replied with a gentle smile. I'm the one who has been walking with you through every dark night for the past 20 years, even when you didn't know I was there. I'm the one who whispered your father's words of love to you in your dreams. I'm the one who has been preparing you for this moment of choice. Harrison fell to his knees behind the bench, overwhelmed by the presence of the divine in his courtroom. Jesus, he whispered, and the name felt like a prayer. Hello, William, Jesus replied, his voice now carrying the full weight of eternity. I've been waiting a long time for you to let me in.
The revelation of Jesus' identity sent shockwaves through the courtroom that seemed to ripple beyond the physical walls and into the very fabric of reality itself. Harrison remained on his knees behind the bench, trembling as he faced the divine presence he had unknowingly been running from for 20 years. Lord, Harrison whispered, his voice breaking with emotion, I've been so lost, I've hurt so many people, I've become everything I swore I'd never be. Jesus stepped closer to the bench, his presence radiating such pure love that everyone in the courtroom felt it washing over them like warm sunlight after a lifetime of winter. The very air seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly peace that made breathing easier, thinking clearer, and hoping possible again. William, do you remember the prayer you used to say every night as a child? Jesus asked gently, his voice carrying the warmth of a father speaking to a beloved son who had been lost for far too long. Harrison's eyes widened as memories flooded back, memories he had buried under decades of hardness and guilt. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And what did you add to the end of that prayer? Jesus asked, his smile containing all the love and patience in the universe. Harrison's breath caught in his throat as the memory surfaced with crystal clarity. He could see himself as a 7-year-old boy, kneeling beside his small bed in their modest Chicago apartment, his father's judicial robes hanging in the closet nearby. I used to add, and please help me help people tomorrow, like Daddy does. That little boy's heart is still inside you, William, Jesus said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. It's been buried under 20 years of pain and guilt, sealed away behind walls of self-punishment and misplaced justice, but it's still there, still beating, with the desire to serve others instead of punishing them. Jesus turned to address the entire courtroom, his voice carrying to every corner, and settling into every heart present like seeds of hope planted in fertile soil. Each of you came here today, thinking you were witnessing routine court proceedings. But nothing in this universe is routine when love is present, nothing is ordinary when hearts are ready to be healed. Patricia stood up slowly, tears streaming down her face as 8 years of watching injustice finally found release. Lord, I've watched Judge Harrison destroy so many families. I've been complicit in it by staying silent, by not fighting harder for justice. I kept detailed records of every excessive sentence, every family torn apart, but I never had the courage to speak up. I'm just as guilty as he is. Jesus looked at her with infinite compassion, seeing not her failures but her heart's true desire for justice. Patricia, do you remember the night 3 years ago when you stayed late to research alternatives to prison for a teenage defendant? You spent your own money printing legal precedents that might help his overworked public defender. Patricia nodded, remembering that cold December evening when she had worked until 2 a.m. in the empty courthouse, desperately searching for any legal precedent that might save 17-year-old Marcus Johnson from being sentenced as an adult for a first-time drug offense. That teenager, Marcus Johnson, was sentenced to community service instead of prison because of your research. Jesus continued, his words healing wounds Patricia didn't even know she carried. He graduated high school, went to college on an academic scholarship, and is now a social worker in Detroit, helping other at-risk youth. Last month he prevented 3 teenagers from joining gangs by connecting them with job training programs. You saved not just him, but every young person he'll help throughout his career, and every family that will stay together because of his intervention. Patricia began sobbing with relief, 8 years of suppressed guilt and frustration finally finding release. She had never known what happened to Marcus, never learned that her secret midnight research had changed the trajectory of his entire life. Jesus continued, his voice reaching into every corner of pain in the room. And Frank, your son Tommy spoke of you constantly in his final weeks. He was trying to get clean because he wanted to make you proud. His friends at the rehabilitation center said he carried a picture of you in his wallet, the one from your police academy graduation, and would tell anyone who would listen about his hero father who put his life on the line every day to protect others. Frank Morrison, the hardened bailiff who had seen every form of human cruelty in his 25 years of law enforcement, broke down completely. His massive frame shook with sobs that came from a place of grief he had locked away for 2 years. For all this time, he had believed his son died hating him, died thinking Frank was a failure as a father who cared more about strangers than his own family. Tommy kept a journal during his last month in rehab, Jesus added gently. On the final page he wrote, I want to be the kind of man my dad would be proud to call his son. He deserves better than the disappointment I've been. He died fighting for sobriety because he loved you, Frank, not because he resented you. The revelation hit Frank like a physical force. His son had been fighting to become worthy of the father who had never stopped believing in him, even when Frank himself had given up hope. Maria Santos, still sitting in the defendant's chair but no longer feeling like a criminal, spoke up hesitantly. Her voice carried the accent of her Salvadoran childhood, softened by 15 years in Chicago. Lord, are you really Jesus, like the Jesus from the stories Abuela Rosa used to tell me? Jesus walked over to her and knelt down beside her chair, putting himself at eye level with this struggling mother whose only crime was loving her child too much to watch him suffer. Yes, Maria. I'm the same Jesus your grandmother Rosa taught you to pray to when you were a little girl in San Salvador. I'm the one she said would never abandon you, no matter how dark things became, no matter how far from home you traveled. Maria gasped, her hand flying to the small silver cross at her throat, the last gift her grandmother had given her before they fled El Salvador's civil war together when Maria was 12. Abuela Rosa used to say you were especially close to mothers and children, Maria whispered, her eyes wide with wonder and recognition. She was right, Jesus replied, reaching out to gently touch Maria's cheek where tears of relief were flowing freely. And she wants you to know that every sacrifice you made for Carlos has been seen and honored in heaven. Every meal you skipped so he could eat, every extra shift you worked to pay for his medicine, every night you stayed awake praying for his health, none of it was in vain. Your love for your son reflects the love I have for all my children. Carlos, Maria's 8-year-old son, had been crying quietly in the gallery throughout the proceedings, his small chest working hard with each breath due to his chronic asthma. But when Jesus looked at him, the boy's tears stopped, and his breathing, normally labored and tight, became clear and easy for the first time in months. "My chest doesn't hurt anymore, Mama," Carlos said in wonder, touching his small chest where the chronic tightness that had plagued him since birth had suddenly disappeared. He took a deep full breath and smiled, the first truly carefree smile he had ever given his mother. The miracle sent murmurs of amazement through the courtroom, but Jesus simply smiled and turned back to Harrison, who was still kneeling behind the bench, overwhelmed by the supernatural healing he was witnessing. "William, I want to show you something," Jesus said, extending his scarred hand toward the judge. "Take my hand and see what I see." Harrison hesitantly reached out and grasped Jesus's hand. The moment their skin made contact, the courtroom around them seemed to fade away, and Harrison found himself standing on a hill overlooking the city of Chicago at night. The view was unlike anything he had ever seen, not just the physical cityscape but something deeper, more spiritual. "This is the view from heaven," Jesus explained, his voice now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Do you see what I see when I look at your city?" Harrison looked out over the sprawling metropolis, expecting to see the crime and corruption that had consumed his thoughts for decades. Instead, he saw points of light scattered throughout the darkness, thousands upon thousands of them, like stars fallen to earth, pulsing and moving with the rhythm of life itself. "What are those lights?" Harrison asked, his voice filled with awe. "Each light is an act of love," Jesus replied. "A mother feeding her children despite having no food for herself, a teacher staying late to help a struggling student understand math, a homeless man sharing his only sandwich with a hungry dog, a nurse holding the hand of a dying patient who has no family, a young father working 2 jobs to provide for his baby, even when desperation drives him to steal formula because his pride won't let him ask for help." Harrison watched in amazement as the lights pulsed and moved throughout the city. Some flickered and dimmed as people struggled with temptation or despair, while others burned brighter as acts of kindness multiplied. Some went out completely when hope was lost, while new ones ignited in unexpected places as love conquered fear. "Your courtroom should have been one of the brightest lights in the city, William," Jesus said gently, his voice carrying no condemnation, only infinite sadness for the opportunity that had been lost. "It should have been a place where broken people found hope, where mercy triumphed over judgment, where love conquered condemnation." Instead, the vision shifted, and Harrison could see his own courtroom as it appeared from heaven's perspective. Instead of light, he saw a void, a place where hope went to die, where love was extinguished, where families were torn apart by the very system that should have protected them. "Instead, it became a black hole," Harrison said, his voice heavy with shame as he saw the true impact of his 20 years of cruelty. "A place that consumed light instead of creating it." "Yes," Jesus agreed, but his voice held no condemnation. "But darkness can always be overcome by light. That's the nature of light. Even the smallest flame can illuminate the deepest darkness. That's why I'm here." The vision shifted again, and Harrison found himself standing in his own courtroom 25 years earlier, on the day he first put on judge's robes. He watched his younger self taking the oath of office, full of hope and idealism, determined to make a difference in the world, to honor his father's legacy of compassionate justice. "This is who you were meant to be," Jesus said as they watched young Harrison promise to administer justice with wisdom and compassion. "This is who you can still become." "The idealistic young man isn't dead, William. He's just been buried under years of guilt and self-punishment." "But how?" Harrison asked desperately, his voice breaking with the weight of 2 decades of accumulated damage. "How do I undo 20 years of harm? How do I face the thousands of families I've destroyed? How do I live with the knowledge of what I've done? Some of those people are still in prison because of my excessive sentences. Some families never recovered from the separations I caused." Jesus placed both hands on Harrison's shoulders, and the judge felt a warmth spreading through his entire being, not just physical warmth, but something deeper. It was the feeling of coming home after a lifetime of wandering lost in a wilderness of guilt and self-recrimination. "The same way every person finds redemption, William," Jesus replied with infinite patience. "One choice at a time, one act of mercy at a time, one decision to choose love over fear. You start by using the authority you still have to review cases, to commute excessive sentences, to reform the system that you helped create.
Jesus paused, his eyes reflecting both the pain of the past and the hope of the future. And you start by establishing programs that address the root causes of crime instead of just punishing its symptoms. Drug rehabilitation instead of prison for addicts. Job training instead of incarceration for the desperate. Mental health treatment instead of punishment for the broken. The vision faded, and they were back in the courtroom. But something had fundamentally changed. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed softer, the cold institutional walls seemed warmer, and every face in the room was filled with hope instead of despair. Jesus walked to the center of the courtroom and addressed everyone present, his voice carrying the authority of absolute love. Each of you has been carrying burdens that were never meant to be borne alone. Patricia, your guilt over your mother's death and your complicity in injustice. Frank, your pain over your son's addiction and your perceived failures as a father. Maria, your desperation to provide for Carlos and your shame at breaking the law. James, your humiliation at needing to steal to feed your daughter. William, your crushing guilt over Michael Rodriguez and the 20 years of cruelty that followed. He paused, looking directly at each person as he spoke their names, seeing into their souls with eyes that held no judgment, only infinite compassion. I came here today to tell you that these burdens can be lifted, the guilt can be transformed into purpose, the pain can be transformed into compassion, the shame can be transformed into strength to help others facing similar struggles. Jesus turned to Harrison one final time, his presence filling the courtroom with a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from within and without. William, I'm offering you a choice that I offer to every human being who has ever lived. You can continue carrying the weight of the past, punishing yourself and others for crimes that mercy could heal, or you can accept the forgiveness that's been waiting for you for 20 years and use the rest of your life to repair what you've broken. Harrison stood up slowly, his legs shaking but his heart steadying for the first time in 2 decades. I choose mercy, he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the night Michael Rodriguez died. I choose forgiveness. I choose to honor Michael's memory by protecting other children instead of destroying their families. I choose to become the man my father believed I could be, the man that 7-year-old boy praying beside his bed dreamed of becoming. As soon as Harrison spoke these words, something miraculous happened. The scars on Jesus's hands and feet began to glow with a soft golden light, and that light seemed to spread throughout the courtroom, touching every person present like a gentle benediction. Patricia felt the last of her guilt about her mother's death and her years of silent complicity lift from her shoulders, like a physical weight being removed. Frank felt his son's love surrounding him, healing 2 years of self-blame and regret. Maria felt hope flooding back into her heart as she realized her struggles weren't in vain. James felt the shame of his poverty transform into determination to build a better life for his daughter through honest work and community support. And Harrison felt the crushing weight he had carried for 20 years simply disappear. Not forgotten, not ignored, but genuinely forgiven and transformed into something beautiful and purposeful. What happens now? Harrison asked, his voice filled with wonder and anticipation. Jesus smiled, and his form began to shimmer slightly, as if he existed partially in this world, and partially in another realm where love was the only law and mercy, the only justice. Now you begin the real work, you reform your court system from within. You establish programs to help struggling families instead of punishing them for their poverty. You work with social services, with churches, with community organizations to address the root causes of crime instead of just its symptoms. Jesus walked toward Patricia's desk and picked up a case file from the stack of pending cases.
Tomorrow you'll hear the case of Angela Martinez, a 17-year-old mother charged with shoplifting diapers for her infant daughter. She dropped out of high school when she got pregnant, and her family disowned her. What will you choose? Mercy, Harrison said without hesitation, his mind already working on solutions. Community service at a daycare center where she can learn child development skills. EED classes so she can finish her education. Connection with programs that provide baby supplies and parenting support. Jesus nodded approvingly and picked up another file. Next week you'll see Robert Chen, a 72-year-old retired teacher charged with stealing prescription medications because Medicare doesn't cover all his heart medication, and he can't afford the $800 a month it costs. What will you choose? Mercy, Harrison repeated, his confidence growing. Medical assistance programs, a reduced-cost pharmacy program for seniors, and community service reading to children at the library, using his teaching skills to give back while addressing his financial needs. File after file, Jesus presented scenarios, and Harrison responded with compassion instead of condemnation, restoration instead of retribution, hope instead of despair. With each answer, Harrison felt more like the man he was meant to be, not just a dispenser of punishment, but a healer of broken systems and broken lives. There will be challenges, Jesus warned, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Other judges may question your methods, calling them too lenient. Prosecutors may complain about your sentences, saying you're soft on crime. Politicians may use your compassion as a weapon against you in election years. Some victims' families may not understand why you're showing mercy to those who hurt them. I don't care,
Harrison said firmly,
his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. I've spent 20 years caring more about my reputation than about doing what's right. I've spent 2 decades worrying about public opinion while ignoring the voice of my conscience. Never again. If showing mercy costs me my position, then so be it. I'd rather lose my job than lose my soul again. Jesus walked toward the courtroom doors, his mission apparently complete, but Harrison called out to him desperately. Wait, please don't leave. How do I know I won't lose my way again? How do I know I won't slip back into being the man I was? What if the guilt returns? What if I forget this moment, and go back to punishing instead of healing? Jesus turned back with a smile that contained all the love in the universe, all the patience of eternity, all the hope of redemption. Because you won't be doing this alone, William. Every time you choose mercy over judgment, I'll be there. Every time you show compassion to someone who doesn't deserve it, you'll be showing the world what my love looks like. Every family you heal will be a testament to the power of forgiveness to transform even the hardest hearts. As Jesus approached the doors, he paused and looked back at the transformed courtroom one final time. The very air seemed charged with possibility, with hope, with the promise of justice tempered by mercy. And William, Jesus said, his voice carrying across the years, to touch the wounded heart of the boy who had hung up angrily on his father 20 years ago. Your father is proud of you. He's been waiting in heaven for this day, praying for this moment, knowing that eventually, his son would remember what justice really means. Dad's been waiting for me, Harrison asked, tears streaming down his face as 20 years of regret and missed reconciliation found their healing. He's been praying for you every day for 20 years, Jesus replied with absolute certainty. He knew this moment would come. He never stopped believing in the boy who wanted to help people like Daddy did. He knew that the son who hung up on him in anger would grow into the man who chose love over vengeance, mercy over judgment, healing over harm. With those words, Jesus walked through the courtroom doors, but instead of simply disappearing, he seemed to become part of the very atmosphere, part of the air they breathed, part of the light that illuminated the room, part of the love that now filled every corner of what had once been a place of judgment and despair. Harrison stood in his transformed courtroom, surrounded by people whose lives had been changed forever. Patricia was already pulling up resources for struggling families on her computer, her efficiency now powered by hope instead of resignation. Frank was writing down phone numbers for grief counselors and addiction support groups he could recommend to other parents who had lost children. Maria was hugging her son, whose breathing remained clear and easy, whispering prayers of gratitude in Spanish. James was already planning how he could use his community service hours to help other desperate fathers navigate the system without resorting to crime. But the greatest transformation was in Harrison himself. The crushing weight of 20 years of guilt had been replaced by something he had forgotten existed: hope. Not just hope for his own redemption, but hope for every person who would stand before his bench in the years to come. Hope for a justice system that could heal instead of harm. Hope for a world where mercy triumphed over vengeance. That afternoon, Harrison went home to his wife Elizabeth, who hadn't seen him smile genuinely in 20 years. She was in the garden behind their suburban home, tending to roses that had struggled to bloom in the shadow of her husband's depression. "William," she said uncertainly when he walked through the back door onto the patio, "you look different, lighter somehow." "I met someone today," Harrison told her, taking her dirt-stained hands in his without caring about his expensive suit. "Someone who reminded me who I used to be, and more importantly, who I can still become." For the first time in their 25-year marriage, Harrison told his wife about Michael Rodriguez, about the accident that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades, about the guilt that had been eating him alive and poisoning every relationship in his life. He told her about the courtroom encounter,
that defied explanation, about the mysterious man who knew impossible things, about the moment when divine love broke through 20 years of self-imposed exile from grace. Elizabeth listened with growing amazement and understanding. For 20 years she had watched her husband retreat into himself, becoming colder and more distant with each passing year. She had seen him wake up screaming in the night, had watched him punish himself with overwork and isolation, had felt him pulling away from her love without understanding why. "You've been carrying this alone for 20 years, she said, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the source of the pain that had nearly destroyed their marriage. "Oh William, why didn't you tell me? I could have helped you carry this burden." They held each other in their garden as the sun set over Chicago, crying together, not tears of despair, but tears of healing, of hope, of new beginnings. For the first time in 2 decades, they talked about the future instead of being haunted by the past. The next morning, Harrison returned to his courtroom with a new purpose and a new perspective. The first case was indeed Angela Martinez, the 17-year-old mother charged with shoplifting diapers. But instead of seeing a young criminal who needed to be taught a lesson, Harrison saw a frightened child trying to care for her baby, the only way she knew how. "Miss Martinez," Harrison said gently, his voice carrying warmth instead of condemnation, "this court recognizes that you were acting out of maternal love, not criminal intent. Instead of jail time, you're sentenced to community service at the Family Resource Center, where you can help other young mothers while completing your GED. The charges will be dismissed upon completion of the program, and this court will ensure you're connected with resources for housing, education, and child care." The transformation of Department 47 didn't happen overnight, but it happened steadily and dramatically. Word spread throughout Chicago's legal community about Judge Harrison's revolutionary change in approach. Some criticized him, calling him soft on crime and weak on justice. Others praised him as a pioneer of restorative justice and a model for judicial reform. But Harrison no longer cared about opinions or reputation or political consequences. He cared only about being faithful to the calling he had received in his courtroom that March day, to choose mercy over judgment, love over fear, healing over harm. Within 6 months, Harrison had established the most comprehensive alternative sentencing program in Illinois. Drug courts that sent addicts to treatment instead of prison, job training programs for nonviolent offenders, family preservation initiatives that kept children with parents whenever possible, mental health courts that addressed the root causes of criminal behavior, instead of just punishing its symptoms. The recidivism rate in Harrison's court dropped by 70%. Families that would have been destroyed by traditional sentencing were healed and strengthened. Children who would have grown up in foster care remained with rehabilitated parents who received the help they needed to succeed. Years later, when Harrison was featured on the cover of Time magazine as the judge who revolutionized justice, he would deflect all praise and say simply, "I didn't revolutionize anything, I just finally remembered what justice was supposed to look like in the first place." But in quiet moments, late at night when he was preparing for the next day's cases, Harrison would look up from his files and whisper to the empty chambers, "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for seeing who I could become instead of who I had been." And in the quiet of his chambers, filled with photos of families he had helped reunite, and letters from people whose lives had been transformed by mercy instead of punishment, he could swear he heard a familiar voice whisper back, "I never give up on anyone, William. That's what love does. That's who I am." Michael Rodriguez had been gone for 20 years, but his death was no longer in vain. In Department 47, where mercy triumphed over judgment, where broken families were healed instead of further broken, where love conquered fear, there Michael's life and death had meaning that rippled outward in waves of healing that would continue for generations. And in heaven, a 7-year-old boy with dark eyes and missing teeth smiled as he watched families staying together because of the mercy shown in the courtroom where his death had once been a secret source of shame, but was now a testament to the power of forgiveness to transform even the hardest hearts into instruments of divine love. The courthouse bells chimed 6 o'clock as Harrison gathered his files for the day. In the morning he would hear 12 more cases, 12 more opportunities to choose healing over harm, mercy over vengeance, love over fear. And with each choice, Michael Rodriguez's legacy would grow a little brighter, and the light that had been missing from Chicago's skyline for 20 years would shine a little more brilliantly into the darkness. The end. What we witnessed in Judge Harrison's courtroom wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a profound demonstration of how one moment of divine intervention can transform decades of pain into purpose. For 20 years Harrison carried the crushing weight of guilt, believing he was alone in his suffering. But Jesus revealed a truth that changed everything. We are never as alone as we think, and our greatest failures can become the foundation for our greatest redemption. The most powerful aspect of this story is how Harrison's transformation rippled outward, touching Patricia, Frank, Maria, and countless families who would benefit from his newfound compassion. When we choose mercy over judgment, love over fear, we don't just heal ourselves, we heal everyone around us. Notice how Jesus didn't erase Harrison's past or pretend the pain never happened. Instead, he transformed that pain into a tool for healing others. The judge who once destroyed families became the protector of families. The man who showed no mercy became mercy's greatest advocate. This reminds us that our darkest moments don't define us, our response to grace does. Harrison spent 20 years punishing himself and others for one tragic accident, but when he finally accepted forgiveness, he discovered that his pain had a purpose: to understand the suffering of every person who would stand before his bench. The miracle wasn't just that Jesus appeared in the courtroom, it was that Harrison finally had the courage to accept the love and forgiveness that had been waiting for him all along. If this story touched your heart, like this video to help us share more transformational stories. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss these life-changing encounters. Share this with someone who needs to hear that forgiveness is possible, no matter how heavy their burden feels. Have you ever carried guilt for something that happened years ago? Have you found it difficult to forgive yourself, even when others have forgiven you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. What moment in Judge Harrison's transformation resonated most deeply with you?